My name is Margaret Ellison, and the day my soul died, the sun still rose, the coffee still brewed, and my husband still asked if I'd ironed his shirts. Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now get in the mood to listen to this story because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. I was standing at the kitchen sink staring at the same chipped tile above the faucet that had been cracked for 6 years. I used to beg him to fix it. Not in a loud way, just gently, kindly. Maybe this weekend, Dan, I'd ask, only to be met with a grunt or a shrug. Over time, I stopped asking. The tile stayed cracked, and I learned to adjust my eyes so I wouldn't see it anymore. That morning, I stood there washing the same mugs we'd used for decades, his, with the faded "World's Best Dad" inscription, mine, with blue roses I never liked, but kept, because he gifted it to me after forgetting our anniversary. And just like that, it hit me, I had disappeared. I don't mean figuratively, I mean truly. Somewhere between the school drop-offs, family dinners, his business trips, my sacrifices, and his silence, I had faded. Margaret, the reader, the dreamer, the woman who used to sing in the car alone, was gone. In her place stood a woman who cooked, cleaned, smiled, and shut up. He walked in, then adjusted his tie in the hallway mirror and without looking at me asked, "You ironed the blue shirts, right?" I didn't answer. I just nodded even though I hadn't. Even though I was too tired last night. Even though he never thanked me anyway. He left with a kiss on my cheek. Not affection routine. Like clocking in. And then the door shut. That was it. That was the moment. It wasn't a slap. It wasn't a scream. It was silence so loud it echoed. I dried my hands on a dish towel and walked into the living room. The couch cushions had the indent of his body. The remote was still aimed at the TV like a weapon. My slippers were by the fireplace like props in a play I no longer wanted to act in. 30 years. 30 years of being the easy wife. The good woman. The one who never said no. Who forgave the coldness. Who made excuses. He's tired. He's stressed. He doesn't mean it. But he did. He meant all of it. The ignoring. The way he'd laugh with his friends and go quiet the moment I entered the room. The way my ideas were met with a dismissive, "That's not practical, Maggie." The way he held me just enough to make sure I stayed, but never enough to make me feel wanted. And the worst part, I let him. I let myself shrink because I thought that's what love meant. That compromise was noble. That being the steady one made me worthy. But all I became was invisible. I sat down with a pad of paper and tried to write a list of things I liked about my life. I couldn't fill more than 3 lines. My daughter Ellie. Black coffee with cream. The feel of freshly laundered sheets. That was it. I didn't even write Dan. I didn't write our home. I didn't write being married. I felt shame creep up my chest, a hot, pulsing guilt. Had I really spent 30 years building a life that didn't feel like mine? The truth was yes, I had. And now I had no idea who I was outside of being his wife. That day, I didn't shower. I didn't put on makeup. I didn't make dinner. I sat with myself for the first time in decades. And it was terrifying. Around 6 p.m., the key turned in the door. I quickly stood and turned off the TV, pretending I had just been tidying up. A reflex so ingrained I didn't even question it. Dan walked in, took off his shoes, didn't notice the missing dinner or the untouched laundry, and muttered, "Busy day." I looked at him. Really looked. His gray hair had thinned. His face sagged a little more than last year. But the expression, the entitlement, was exactly the same, and I knew something he didn't. That morning, I woke up as his wife. That night, I went to bed as a woman preparing to leave. I hadn't packed a bag. I hadn't called a lawyer. I hadn't told a soul. But the decision was planted, a seed deep inside me pushing against the rot. And in that silence, I whispered the words to myself, I want my life back. Not for revenge, not for drama, but because I was still alive. And I had wasted too much time dying quietly in someone else's story. That night, I laid next to him in bed, eyes open in the dark. He snored beside me like the world was fine. But I was awake, fully awake for the first time in years. I used to believe we had a love story, not the fairy tale kind, but the solid, respectable kind. Dan and I met in college. He was charming, ambitious, the kind of man who knew how to command a room without raising his voice. I was drawn to that confidence. At the time, I mistook it for strength. He used to leave notes in my textbooks, little scribbles in the margins that made me blush. "You're brilliant," he'd write. Or "I'm the luckiest man in the lecture hall." I held onto those scraps like sacred proof that I mattered. We married young, just after graduation. I was 25. He had landed a junior executive role. I shelved my dream of a literature PhD, deciding instead to take a job at the local library. "Just for now," I said. "Until things settle." But things never settled. Life became mortgage payments, dinner schedules, promotions for him. For me, it became making space. I remember our first home, a modest 2-bedroom with uneven floors. We painted the walls together and laughed when the ceiling fan fell mid-installation. I thought those were the memories that made a marriage. But they faded one by one under the weight of his expectations. It started with small things. The way he'd correct me when I spoke in front of friends. "What Margaret means is," and I'd smile, even though it stung. The way he always chose what movie we watched, what car we bought, what vacation we took, and how I let him. Back then, I thought compromise was part of love, that giving in was the price you paid to keep peace. But it wasn't peace. It was erasure. By our 10th anniversary, I'd stopped choosing anything. He brought me roses that year, long-stemmed, wrapped in gold paper, and I cried in the bathroom while he watched football. Not because the gift was bad, because it was generic. It screamed, "This is what husbands do not. This is what Margaret loves." Because he didn't know what I loved anymore. And I didn't either. There was a particular moment I now see as the beginning of the end. We were at a dinner party. One of his colleagues brought up poetry, Rilke of all things, and I lit up. I hadn't talked about poetry in years, and I quoted something offhandedly. Dan chuckled not kindly and said, "Don't mind her, she's got all this dusty librarian knowledge." Everyone laughed politely. I laughed too. Of course I did. But inside, something cracked. Not because he embarrassed me, but because he'd reduced me. He didn't even hear what I said. He only saw what role I played for him, the charming accessory, the placeholder wife. After that night, I stopped talking in groups. Better to be silent than diminished. And slowly, I began to understand Dan didn't love me. He loved the idea of me, the woman who didn't interrupt, who kept his life in perfect quiet order, who took his shirts to the cleaner and packed his suitcase and knew when to be invisible. That wasn't love. That was utility. He didn't ask how my day was. He didn't notice when I cut my hair or when I stopped wearing earrings. He didn't see me. And over time, I stopped expecting him to. But there were moments, rare, brief, when I tried to reach him again. Once I planned a weekend getaway. Just us. I booked a cabin, cooked his favorite meals, even packed his books. I wanted to talk, to connect, to remember who we were. We lasted half a day. By nightfall, he was on his phone. Work calls, sports updates, silence. I said gently, "I miss us." He looked up like I'd spoken in a foreign language. "What's wrong with us?" And I realized he felt nothing was missing, because he still had everything he needed. But I didn't. I was starving. Not for affection or sex or romance, but for recognition, to be seen, heard, valued. Instead, I became the wallpaper of our life, always present, never noticed. He didn't hit me. He didn't cheat. He didn't scream. But slowly he made me disappear. And that was the cruelty, the subtle, insidious kind that no one sees. The kind that makes you doubt your pain. the kind you can't even name. So I told myself, this is what marriage becomes. I believed the lie. I told friends I was lucky, that Dan was stable, reliable. I wore the mask so long I forgot it was there. But now looking back, I know the truth. I wasn't in love. I was in survival. A long, slow suffocation that dressed itself in normalcy. And the saddest part, I stayed. For years. Because I didn't think I deserved more. Because I thought love was supposed to be hard. Because I thought silence was better than loneliness. But silence is a kind of loneliness. The most dangerous kind. The one you carry inside your chest while cooking dinner and folding sheets and smiling through parties. I remember once reading a line, "There are marriages that feel like slow suicides." At the time, I underlined it. I didn't know why. Now I do. The first time I realized the house no longer felt like a home. I was on my knees rearranging the living room, not for my comfort, but to match Dan's preference. He said the couch made the room feel off balance. I had originally placed it to catch the morning light on my reading chair. I used to love that light, warm and soft like a second skin in winter. But that didn't matter. What mattered was his sense of symmetry, his sense of control. So I moved it, quietly, without complaint, like always. After he left for work, I sat down on the arm of the chair, now repositioned to face the television instead of the window, and I felt diminished, like a guest in a staged Airbnb. Like someone had redecorated my body and forgot to ask me first. You see, a house doesn't become a cage overnight. There are no clangs, no slamming doors, just the slow withdrawal of permissions. 1,000 quiet edits to your autonomy until you're living in parentheses. At first, it was just preferences. The thermostat he always turned down because I ran too cold. The meals I learned not to cook because he made a face. Too spicy, too mushy, not filling enough. The bookshelf I wasn't allowed to reorganize because he didn't like the cluttered look. My music replaced by silence. My books relegated to a single shelf in the hallway beside the vacuum. I had stopped choosing. Not because I couldn't, but because I knew what would follow if I did. It wasn't abuse in the way people recognize. There were no bruises, no doors slammed in my face, no shouting. But there were rules. Unspoken shifting and always one step ahead of my intuition. He would sigh if I laughed too loud during a movie. He would raise an eyebrow if I poured a second glass of wine. He would glance at my clothes and say nothing, just enough for me to go back and change. Once I wore red lipstick to a dinner party. "You look different," he said, lips pursed. "Maybe tone it down." I washed it off before the guests arrived. Later that night, he wrapped his arm around me and said in front of everyone, "She always looks so elegant, doesn't she?" They nodded, smiled. I smiled too. But I felt like I was disappearing. And disappearing wasn't new. I had been vanishing in increments for years. He didn't like when I journaled. Still doing that teenage poetry thing, he'd say, glancing down at my notebook like it was a silly habit I should have grown out of. So I started writing in secret, quick entries scribbled during laundry loads or in the car before grocery runs. I started hiding my thoughts like contraband. That's the thing about emotional control. It doesn't yell. It whispers, erodes, rearranges you without your consent. It makes you forget what peace felt like. Every room in that house mirrored him, his books, his leather recliner, his minimalist artwork, grayscale abstracts I never liked but praised because it was easier. The walls were cold, not just in color but in atmosphere. There was no softness, no mess, no signs of life, just curated order. Even our bedroom, especially our bedroom, felt sterile. He liked it cold, silent, functional. I slept curled beneath extra blankets, longing for heat not just of the room, but of his attention. His warmth had been rationed long ago, reserved only for when it made him look good. I remember once sitting in the corner of our bed watching him undress. I asked if he remembered our anniversary plans from years ago, a weekend trip we'd once promised ourselves. He blinked, distracted, and said, "Why would we do that now?" That night, I dreamed I was screaming underwater. The only place I still felt like me was the laundry room tucked behind the kitchen with bad lighting and the constant hum of the dryer. It was too domestic for him. He never entered it. I found freedom next to the detergent. Sometimes I'd sit on the edge of the washer and read while the clothes spun, not for pleasure, just to exist, just to hear the sound of something turning, something moving, even if it was just socks and sheets. One day, while sorting his shirts, I found a faint lipstick stain on a collar. It wasn't mine. I held the fabric in my hands for a long time. My fingers didn't tremble. My heart didn't race. I didn't feel betrayal. I felt nothing. Not because I didn't care, but because by then I had already lost everything that made me feel, including the ability to be surprised. I washed the shirt, bleached it, folded it crisply. That was my rebellion, precise, silent compliance, the kind that said I see you without a single word. That evening, I handed it to him as he walked in. He didn't notice the bleach smell. He kissed my cheek, distracted, and I smiled. That moment taught me more than any fight ever could. I wasn't his partner. I was his mirror, his routine, his wallpaper. He never had to raise his voice. I had already memorized the script. Stay agreeable. Stay small. Don't ask for more than he's willing to give. And above all, never make him uncomfortable. That was the invisible contract I signed somewhere between I do and I'm done. But something had started whispering inside me. Something stubborn. Something unfinished. What if I broke the rules? What if I started choosing again? What if I lit a candle, turned on, the music, wore the lipstick, and didn't apologize? I wasn't ready to answer those questions. Not yet. But the whisper was there, soft, steady. And whispers, when heard long enough, become voices. And voices, when finally trusted, become exits. He always smiled when other people were watching. That was Dan's favorite trick. The public warmth that made everyone think I was the luckiest woman in the room. He'd put his arm around me at dinners, pour my wine at parties, laugh just a little louder at my jokes. He played the part so well it made me question the quiet cruelty behind closed doors. But I saw the difference. I lived the difference. It was the smile that silenced me the most, not because it was loving, but because it was performative. A mask. A lie I was required to co-star in. We were at a charity event once, a fundraiser for a local school. He stood beside me, hand resting lightly on my back, while he told the story of how we met. The crowd laughed when he described me as a shy little bookworm who couldn't resist his charm. I laughed too. I always laughed. But inside, I wanted to scream. Because that wasn't the truth. I hadn't been shy, I had been thoughtful. I hadn't been unable to resist, I had chosen him. Chosen him over offers in other cities, over my acceptance to a graduate program, over the version of myself I could have become. He rewrote me in public, and I let him. I smiled. Because disagreeing in front of others would have made things awkward. That was one of his favorite phrases. Why do you always make things awkward, Maggie? So I didn't. I kept things easy, neat, polite. At home, the smile faded. The backhanded jokes returned. The silence came back to fill the rooms like fog. I remember asking him once very softly, "Do you think we still make each other happy?" He looked up from his newspaper, blinked, and said, "We're comfortable." That's more than most people can say. Comfortable. As if marriage was just a long hallway you walk through side by side without speaking. But comfort in our house meant obedience. It meant routine. It meant my desires shelved quietly like the unused tea set in the attic. Even the way he complimented me was cold. "You're good at staying calm. You don't nag like other women. You keep things running." He didn't love me. He appreciated my efficiency. And when I tried to open up even a little, he shut it down with a smile. One evening, I was feeling low. I tried to tell him about a dream I had one where I was running barefoot through a garden free and weightless. I thought he might ask what it meant. Instead, he smiled and said, "You should write that down. Maybe it'll help you process your middle-age crisis." He said it lightly, lovingly, almost. But the way it landed, it folded me in half. I excused myself and went to bed early. I stared at the ceiling fan until I felt nothing at all. Because when someone minimizes your truth over and over, it doesn't just hurt, it rewires your brain. You start thinking maybe you're too sensitive, too emotional, too much. That's what I became afraid of, being too much. So I became less, quieter, smaller, easier. I stopped telling stories. I stopped sharing thoughts. I stopped laughing at things I found funny unless he laughed first. My voice adjusted to his tone, my pace to his stride. And yet, to the outside world, he was perfect. He remembered birthdays, donated to causes, opened doors, said the right things at the right times. People admired him, envied me. My own sister once said, "God, I wish my husband was more like Dan." I smiled. I wanted to say, "You don't. You don't want a man who disappears the moment the door closes, who listens to you only long enough to respond with a correction, who kisses your forehead not out of affection, but as a form of punctuation, a closing to your sentence." But who would believe me? There were no bruises, no yelling, just years of small cuts that no one could see. Even when I cried quietly, in the shower, in the car, never loud enough for him to hear. That would have made things uncomfortable. I became an actress, the role so ingrained I couldn't tell where the performance ended and the person began. But one night, everything shifted, not because he did something worse, but because I watched myself play the part and couldn't recognize the lines. We were at dinner with another couple. He was telling a story, one I'd heard 100 times, about a vacation we'd taken. He exaggerated, like always, adding jokes, tweaking details. Everyone laughed. I looked at him, animated and charming, and felt like I was watching a stranger. Then I looked at myself, smiling, nodding, and I didn't feel like me either. I excused myself and went to the bathroom. I stood in front of the mirror for a long time. My lipstick was too pale, my hair too neat, my eyes too empty. And I whispered to the woman in the mirror, "You don't have to keep doing this." It was the first honest thing I'd said to myself in years. I returned to the table. I played along. I smiled and clinked glasses. But something inside me had cracked quietly, like a frozen lake beneath footsteps. And I knew once it started, there was no going back. It started slowly, my isolation. One friend stopped calling after I missed her birthday dinner. Another drifted away when I declined 3 coffee dates in a row. Eventually, they all slipped away like loose threads unraveling from the hem of a forgotten dress. I didn't blame them. Not entirely. At first, it was life, kids, work, distance. But deep down, I knew the real reason I was hard to reach. Not geographically, emotionally. And I hadn't always been that way. I used to be the one who planned the brunches, who remembered birthdays and sent handwritten notes. I laughed loud. I told stories. I listened without looking at a clock. But Dan didn't like me that way. He'd say things like, "You talk too much when you're with them," or "Every time you spend time with your girlfriends, you come back restless." So I started limiting myself. An hour here, 30 minutes there. Polite excuses. The kids need me or Dan, and I have plans. Little lies that made it easier. Over time, the invitations stopped, and in their absence, he smiled, because that's how control works. Not through force, through conditioning. He never said, "Don't see your friends." He just made it inconvenient, made me feel guilty, made it seem like I was abandoning him. One night I came home from a rare dinner with a friend, one I hadn't seen in months. My heart was light. my smile real for the first time in weeks. Dan was waiting in the kitchen, arms crossed. "How was it?" he asked. "Lovely," I said. We talked for hours. He nodded. Then came the quiet jab. "Wish you'd smile like that when you're with me." That was all it took. The joy drained out of me like water down a sink. The next time she texted to meet, I said I wasn't feeling well, and it wasn't a lie. I really wasn't. Not in the way she'd understand, but in the way a caged bird loses interest in the sky. Even my phone became a trigger. Every message from a friend became a decision. Will this create tension? Will this disturb the delicate balance I keep with Dan? Eventually, I stopped responding altogether. I told myself it was just a phase, that I'd reconnect when things calmed down. But things never calmed down. They calcified, hardened into a rhythm that left no room for others. Dan preferred it that way. He'd say things like, "Why do you need anyone else? I'm right here." Or "Friends are distractions. We have each other, isn't that enough?" It sounded like love, but it wasn't. It was ownership. I became his possession, not in dramatic ways, but in tiny, polite permissions that I had to ask for. "Can I go out this weekend? Can I call so-and-so? Can I spend the day alone?" Eventually, I stopped asking. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew the answer before I even opened my mouth. The worst part wasn't the loneliness. It was the shame. Shame that I had let it happen, that I had gone along with it, that I had watched my world shrink and told myself it was fine. I made excuses for him, told myself he just loved me too much, that he feared losing me, that he was old-fashioned, that he didn't know how to express himself. But the truth is, he knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that without friends, I wouldn't have anyone to compare my life to. No mirrors, no questions, no witnesses. And for a long time, it worked. Until one day, a letter came in the mail. It was from a woman named Marjorie, an old coworker from the library where I used to work. We'd lost touch after I quit. She had heard from someone that Dan and I were doing well. She wrote, "I miss our lunch breaks and long talks. Are you still writing?" I read it 3 times. The last line broke me. "I hope you're still in there." I sat on the edge of the bed holding the letter like a lifeline. Was I still in there? Had I become someone even I wouldn't recognize? I wanted to write back. I wanted to tell her everything, but I didn't. I hid the letter under my mattress like a secret. That night, I dreamed I was standing in a crowd of women, all of them blurry, talking, laughing, and I stood alone in the middle, screaming, but no one heard me. When I woke up, my pillow was damp. I told Dan I had a headache. He nodded and said, "Probably too much screen time. You should stop reading those sad books." Another silencing, but that letter, it stayed with me. I took it out sometimes when he was gone and read it like scripture. Proof that someone had seen me once, that I hadn't always been invisible. Around that time, our daughter Ellie called. She was in her 20s by then, living 2 states away. "Mom," she said hesitantly, "are you okay?" That question, so simple, so direct, shook me. I wanted to say yes. Of course. I'm fine. But instead I stayed silent. She waited. Then she said, "You don't sound like you anymore." And just like that, something cracked. I swallowed hard and said, "Maybe I'm not." It was the first honest thing I'd said in a long time. Ellie didn't press. She just said, "I love you. Call me if you ever want to talk. About anything." And she meant it. I could hear it in her voice, that soft, inherited intuition. The one I used to have before I gave it up for marriage. After we hung up, I sat in the dark. Alone, but not invisible. For the first time in years, someone had seen through the smile. And now that the mask had cracked, I didn't know if I could keep wearing it. If you had visited our home, you wouldn't have seen anything alarming. The dishes were always clean. The floors gleamed. Dan and I never fought in front of anyone. We were functional the way people describe a well-oiled machine. But what no one saw, what even I didn't fully understand, was that the machine ran on silence. It was powered by suppression. There was no screaming, no broken plates, no bruises. That's what made it harder to explain. Emotional abuse doesn't come with sirens. It comes with sighs, with raised eyebrows, with silence so heavy it makes you question whether you're crazy for wanting more. It was in the way he responded to my joy. I remember once laughing out loud at something I'd read. Dan glanced up from his tablet and said, "What's so funny? Not curious, critical?" His tone made me instantly quiet, like I had disrupted a sacred ritual. I handed him the article, but he barely looked at it. "Yeah, I don't get it," he muttered. "You always find weird stuff funny." And just like that, I closed the tab. And my mouth. Another time I came home from the grocery store with a new soap, something lavender, soft, and floral. I wanted the house to feel gentler, more like me. As I put it in the bathroom, Dan caught the scent and wrinkled his nose. "God, what is that?" he said, half laughing. "You know I hate that flower crap." The bottle went under the sink, and I bought the unscented one next time. These moments stacked like invisible bricks, walling me into a place I didn't even know I was building. He would say things like, "You're lucky I'm not like other husbands," and I'd nod, even though I had no basis for comparison anymore. He made sure of that, isolating me just enough to believe that my life, however dull, was better than what I could find out there. And when I did speak up cautiously, gently, I was met with confusion or mockery. "You're being dramatic. Don't be so sensitive. Why do you always want to turn things into a problem?" I began to internalize it. Maybe I was too much? Too needy? Too soft? So I stopped speaking up. Even about the little things, like how I hated how cold the bedroom always was, or how I wanted us to sit at the dinner table instead of in front of the TV, or how I missed reading aloud together the way we used to in the early years. Eventually, I started talking to myself. Not in the way that sounds frightening. Just quiet murmurings while I folded clothes, while I cooked, while I waited for the kettle to boil. I'd say things like, "That wasn't fair," or "You could have said thank you after he walked out of a room," as if I were practicing what I should have said. As if I were trying to convince myself that I was still in there somewhere. But the truth was, I was scared of my own voice. Because if I used it fully, I knew it would lead to the truth. And the truth was, I wasn't loved. I was maintained. I remember once telling a friend back when I still had friends that Dan was like a thermostat. He kept the temperature just right, so I'd never think to check the weather outside. But I was always cold inside. And yet, he was never overtly cruel. That's what made it all so confusing. He didn't yell. He didn't cheat. Not that I knew of. He didn't insult me, at least not with words you could quote. He didn't say, "You're stupid." But he'd sigh and say, "You wouldn't understand, it's business stuff." He didn't say, "You're worthless." But he'd say, "You really need to stop reading those self-help books. They're messing with your head." And when I cried the quiet kind when I thought he was asleep, he never turned over to ask why. He just kept snoring. His version of cruelty was neglect. His weapon was detachment. And the worst part, I defended him. When Ellie once asked, "Is Dad ever mean to you?" I laughed and said, "Oh, honey, no. He's just not emotional." But she tilted her head, that thoughtful expression she always had, and said, "But you don't seem happy." I brushed it off. But I thought about it for weeks. Because she was right. I wasn't. I hadn't been for years. One day I looked in the mirror and said out loud, "He's not hurting you. So why are you sad all the time?" The reflection didn't answer. But I heard the real question underneath. What if the absence of kindness is its own kind of violence? What if indifference isn't better than anger, but worse? Because anger, at least, is engagement. What Dan gave me was apathy. shrugging shoulders, faded interest, the kind of vacancy that makes you feel like a ghost in your own kitchen. He saw me only when it served him when company came over, or when he needed something ironed, or when he was in the mood for sex. But for the rest of the time, I might as well have been furniture. Functional, familiar, silent. I began to journal again cautiously in a locked drawer. I wrote things I didn't know I still remembered, like the color of the sweater I wore the day we moved into the house, or how he used to trace my collarbone when I read in bed. I wrote these memories like autopsies trying to figure out when love had died. And one day, while writing, I asked myself, what would I do if I had no fear? The answer came too fast. I'd leave. It startled me, made me sit still for a long time, because once that thought is spoken even silently, it becomes real. It becomes a possibility. And possibility after years of suppression is dangerous, because it tastes like freedom. And once you've had a sip of that, no amount of quiet compliance can make you forget. It was just a question. Simple. Direct. Mom, are you okay? Ellie's voice came through the phone like sunlight through stained glass, soft, warm, and colored by concern. I was sitting in the kitchen watching the steam rise from a cup of tea I hadn't touched. Dan was upstairs. The house was quiet but not peaceful. Just paused. That kind of stillness where everything holds its breath. I hadn't spoken to Ellie in over a week. We usually texted little updates, photos of her cat, a joke about something I'd mailed her. But this time she'd called. No reason. Just a feeling. And then that question. Are you okay? The silence that followed was longer than I expected. Yes, I said. Automatically. Too quickly. She didn't buy it. You don't sound like you. I laughed light and rehearsed. I'm just tired. I didn't sleep well. But I felt her listening harder. She's always been that way, reading between the pauses, noticing the cracks in my tone. Even as a child, she used to place her hand on mine and say, "Don't say you're fine if you're not." And here she was again, all grown up, reaching for me across state lines. Mom, she said gently, do you ever just feel numb? The question nearly knocked the wind out of me. Because yes, that was the word I hadn't said aloud. Numb, not sad, not angry. Just hollowed out from the inside like someone had scooped out all my colors and left only beige behind. I don't know, I replied quietly. She paused and I heard her inhale like she was about to say something important. But then she just whispered, okay. That okay held everything: understanding, patience, permission. We talked a little longer about mundane things, her classes, her apartment, the price of avocados. But when we hung up, I sat there frozen, because for the first time someone had seen through me. And that kind of visibility is both terrifying and healing. I didn't want Ellie to worry. I didn't want her to feel responsible for me. But I also didn't want to keep lying, especially not to her. She was the only person who'd ever made me feel fully seen. That night, I tried to talk to Dan. Not about Ellie, about us. We were lying in bed. He was reading news on his phone. I stared at the ceiling, feeling my heart pound like a slow drum. Dan. I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Do you ever feel like we're drifting? He didn't look at me. What do you mean, I mean? We don't really talk anymore. About real things. He let out a soft scoff. We've been married 30 years, Maggie. It's not supposed to feel like high school. I know, but I feel like we're just going through motions. He finally looked at me, annoyed, not concerned. What brought this on? I didn't answer. Because I didn't want to say, your silence, or your absence, or our daughter hears me better than you do. Instead, I said, I just think we should reconnect. He rolled over. Don't overthink it, he muttered. Everything's fine. And just like that, the conversation was over. I laid there, eyes open in the dark, listening to his breathing grow steady and slow. I used to find comfort in that rhythm. Now it felt like a metronome marking the seconds of a life half lived. The next morning, something in me shifted. I walked past the hallway mirror and paused. I looked tired, older than I remembered. But there was something else, a flicker behind my eyes. Not defiance. Not yet. But awareness. I started watching him. Not in a paranoid way, just observing. How he never asked how I slept. How he'd hum to himself while I set his plate down but never said thank you. How he talked at me. Not to me. It was like watching a film you'd seen 100 times but suddenly noticing the background details you missed before. And I started recording my own thoughts. Not in a journal. On my phone. A voice memo app. Nothing dramatic. Just my voice late at night whispering truths into the dark. I felt invisible at dinner tonight. I wanted to laugh but stopped myself. I don't know who I am anymore. Each recording was only a minute or two, but they stacked up, became evidence. Not of his behavior, but of my erasure. I started re-listening to them while folding laundry, hearing myself from the outside. It was like meeting a stranger who had my voice. And I realized something chilling. If I met this woman, I would tell her to leave. That realization cracked something deep. Because if I could have compassion for that recorded voice, that tired woman, with the whispers and the bruised spirit, then why couldn't I have it for myself? Why couldn't I give myself the advice I gave others? Ellie's words haunted me. You don't sound like you. And she was right, because I didn't know what I sounded like anymore. That weekend, while Dan was in the garage, I pulled out a photo album from our early years. Vacations, holidays, birthdays. There was one picture me at 29 laughing in the sun holding Ellie on my hip. My hair was loose. My smile was wide. There was light in my eyes. I stared at it for a long time. Then I whispered, "Come back to me." I didn't know who I was speaking to, the woman in the photo or myself. Maybe both. Because somehow they were the same. One buried under 30 years of be quiet and be good and be agreeable. But I wasn't dead. Not yet. And Ellie's call, that simple piercing question, had done something I wasn't ready for. It had woken me up. It was a Sunday afternoon, quiet, warm, the kind of day where nothing extraordinary is supposed to happen. Dan was outside trimming the hedges, the hedge trimmer buzzing like an insect. I was inside cleaning up the kitchen, wiping down surfaces that were already clean. I wasn't really cleaning. I was avoiding something. I don't remember exactly why I opened the drawer in the hallway. Maybe I was looking for batteries. Maybe I was looking for something I'd lost. But what I found stopped me cold. It was a leather notebook, black, worn at the edges, soft from handling. Dan wasn't a journaler, or at least I didn't think he was. He mocked the idea often enough. Only people with too much time on their hands write down their feelings. But there it was, tucked under a pile of outdated chargers and old receipts. I turned it over in my hands for a long time. I thought about putting it back, respecting his privacy. But then I thought about how little privacy I'd had for 30 years. How every part of me had been open for his inspection. So I opened it. The first page was dated almost 8 years ago. At first, I didn't understand what I was reading. They weren't diary entries. Not in the traditional sense. They were reflections, notes, lists, observations, cold analytical thoughts about me. Maggie resists change, must ease her into decisions gradually. Maggie retreats when pressured. Better to guide her subtly. Maggie is less reactive after physical intimacy. Use this timing for difficult conversations. I felt sick. It read like a manual, a strategy guide. Like I was something to be managed, not loved. A system to maintain. A behavior to adjust. There was a section titled Containment Tactics. I blinked. Reread it. Containment. Limit external influence. Maggie's energy changes after long visits with friends. Consider redirecting with small home improvement projects or short travel getaways. Interrupt emotional spirals with logic. She deflates when confronted with facts. She's calmer when given compliments in front of others. Reinforce the public image. I turn the pages faster, my hands trembling. Each note was clinical, detached. Not once did he write, "I love her." Not once did he wonder what I wanted. It wasn't a journal. It was a control log, a blueprint of my emotional confinement. He had studied me, not to understand me, but to manage me. I sat down on the floor, notebook in hand, and felt the weight of it all settle on my chest. I wasn't imagining the manipulation. It had been real, deliberate. Every time I'd felt crazy for reacting, he'd orchestrated that. Every time I second-guessed my instincts, he'd anticipated that. I had always told myself it wasn't that bad, that it was just his way, that I was being dramatic. But he knew, and he wrote it down. I heard the garage door close. Panicked, I shoved the notebook back in the drawer beneath the receipts. I straightened my shirt and walked into the kitchen just as Dan entered through the back door. He kissed my cheek. I flinched. He didn't notice. Made good progress on the hedges, he said. They were getting wild. I looked at him. Really looked. This man with his smudged glasses and sun-reddened face was a stranger. Or maybe he always had been, and I was only now seeing him clearly. "Want some lemonade?" I asked. He smiled. "That'd be nice." I poured it. My hands steady now. We sat at the table. He drank. I watched. And inside me something hardened. Not into hate. Not yet. But into resolve. Later that night, while he watched TV, I snuck back into the hallway and took a picture of the most damning pages. I sent them to a private email account I had created weeks earlier but never used. Then I placed the journal back exactly as I found it. But now it was different. Now I had proof. Not for the world. Not for court. For me. Proof that I hadn't exaggerated. That I wasn't oversensitive. That the cage I felt wasn't imaginary. I slept little that night. I laid awake staring at the ceiling, feeling every breath as if it were someone else's. And sometime around 3 a.m., I whispered aloud, "He's been keeping me small on purpose." The words felt foreign, heavy, but true. And once the truth is spoken, even in the dark, it cannot be unsaid. The next morning, Dan kissed me goodbye like usual. I smiled like usual. Then I locked the door behind him and slid down to the floor. I cried, not the silent kind, but deep, full-body sobs. I cried for the woman I had been, for the girl who had fallen in love with a man who saw her as a project, for the years I spent negotiating with a warden who disguised himself as a husband, and when the tears dried, I stood. I wasn't done, but I wasn't asleep anymore. I began talking to myself. Not in the way people fear, not the frantic muttering of someone slipping into madness. It was gentler than that, a quiet, necessary reclamation. I'd stand in the bathroom brushing my teeth and whisper, "You're real, Maggie. You're still here." I'd fold laundry and murmur, "He doesn't get to define you." I wasn't losing my mind. I was finding my voice. It started as small, accidental whispers, thoughts I didn't want to forget, reactions I never got to say out loud. One afternoon while cleaning the fridge, I heard myself say, "I hate this silence." It startled me. The sentence had left my mouth before I knew I was thinking it. I froze. Because it was true. Not just the silence in the room, the silence in my life. I bought a cheap voice recorder app. At first it felt silly, but I needed a place that was mine. Somewhere Dan couldn't reach. Somewhere I didn't have to translate myself into someone he could tolerate. I started recording voice notes in the car in the backyard behind the closed bathroom door. 1 or 2 minutes at a time. Sometimes I'd start with, "I'm not crazy," or "This is real," or simply, "I'm tired." The voice I heard on playback was unfamiliar at first, raspy, cautious, worn thin from years of being told not to make waves. But it was mine. And the more I listened, the more I realized how much I had been editing myself even in private. I had internalized his voice so deeply that I was afraid of my own opinions even when alone. One day I played back a recording from the night before. I had said, "I think he's made me afraid to feel." Then there was a pause. And I let him. That admission gutted me, but it also freed me. Because once I said it, once I owned my part, I could begin to take it back. I started doing small things I knew he wouldn't like. I lit a lavender candle in the bedroom. I bought a bright red sweater. I played music while I cooked Nina Simone Aretha Tracy Chapman, voices full of strength and ache and memory. He noticed. He didn't say much, just side glances, a comment here and there. "Bit loud today, huh? You going through a phase or something?" I smiled, said nothing. The day I made pasta with mushrooms, a dish he always claimed made the house smell musty, I served it without apology. He ate it, in silence. Not because he wanted to, but because he was confused. Something in our equation had changed. The rules were shifting. And I didn't stop there. I started walking in the mornings, long, slow walks through our neighborhood. No destination, just movement, just air. Sometimes I'd cry behind my sunglasses. Sometimes I'd smile at nothing. But always I'd speak into my phone, one note at a time. I felt good today. I remembered who I was when I was 20. I deserve better. Each sentence was like a match struck in a cave. And slowly I began to see. I was still in there, the real me, under the years, under the control, under the performance. One night I dreamed I was on a stage delivering a monologue to an empty theater. The lights were blinding. The seats were vacant. But I spoke anyway. When I woke up, I realized I didn't need an audience. I just needed to stop silencing myself. Dan noticed eventually. He walked into the kitchen one afternoon while I was laughing, truly laughing, at a text from Ellie. He looked up from his tablet and said, "You've been different lately." I didn't flinch. "Better or worse?" I asked, meeting his eyes. He studied me. "I don't know yet." That was honest, at least. But it told me everything. He saw the shift. He just didn't know how to stop it. Because control only works on someone still trying to please. And I was done pleasing. My recordings grew longer, more honest, sometimes angry, sometimes mournful, sometimes even joyful. I talked about the early days when I really loved him, when he used to hold my hand in public and tell me my mind was beautiful. I talked about the years that followed, the slow fade, the edits to myself, the hunger for affection that never came. And I talked about the future, vague, undefined, but mine. "I don't know where I'll go," I said into the phone one day, "but I know I can't stay here forever." It wasn't a plan, but it was a declaration, and that's where real change begins. Not with escape, but with acknowledgement. With the courage to say, "I am not okay with this." With the power to whisper, "I deserve more." And with the strength to listen, not to the man beside me, not to the world around me, but to the quiet, persistent voice within. The voice that said, "You are still here." I told Dan I was going to the grocery store. Instead, I went to therapy. It felt like trespassing, like I was breaking some rule that had been tattooed into my bones. For 30 years, I had put everyone else first. Every schedule, every meal, every conversation shaped around Dan's rhythms. My needs tucked away like winter clothes in July, unnecessary, out of season, easily forgotten. But that Tuesday morning, I walked into a beige office with a flickering fern in the corner and told a stranger my marriage felt like a room with no windows. The therapist's name was Laura. She looked kind, the sort of face that belonged behind a warm cup of tea. She greeted me like I was normal, like I deserved to be there. I sat on her couch like a child caught in the act. "I'm not sure why I'm here," I began. She nodded. "You're here because something hurts." That cracked me open. I didn't cry right away. I talked. A lot. About Dan. About the notebook I'd found. About the voice recordings. About Ellie's phone call. I said all the things I'd only whispered to myself. I spilled them out like marbles on the floor, unsure which ones mattered. Laura listened. She didn't interrupt. Didn't blink too much when I said, "Sometimes I think I disappeared and no one noticed." When I finally stopped, she said, "Maggie, what would you call it if someone made you feel small on purpose for 30 years? I blinked. "I don't know." "What would you call it if they isolated you, monitored your reactions, and slowly erased your sense of self?" I stared at the floor. "Abuse," I whispered. She nodded. I shook my head. "But he's never hit me. Never screamed. He provides. He's not." She gently held up a hand. "Emotional abuse doesn't need bruises, Maggie. It needs silence. It needs your compliance. And it sounds like he's had both." I didn't want to believe it. I had spent so many years justifying Dan's behavior, explaining it to friends, to Ellie, to myself. But something about the way she said it, calm, confident, without drama, made it sink in. We talked about power, about learned helplessness, about how women like me, thoughtful, kind, careful, were often the most easily erased. By the end of that first session, I felt like I had been excavated. Laura gave me homework. Write down everything that makes you feel like a person again, no matter how small. No judgment. So I did. The next day, I sat in the car outside the grocery store and started my list, walking in bare feet on grass. Nina Simone's voice. Red lipstick. Laughing with Ellie. The smell of rain on pavement. Writing. I wrote until the ink ran out. When I got home, Dan was at the kitchen table. "Forgot the eggs," he said, holding up the list I'd left on the counter. "I'll go back tomorrow," I replied, heart still pounding from the session. He looked up. "You all right?" I smiled. "Just tired." I didn't tell him where I'd really been. Not yet. I kept going to therapy. Once a week. Always wrapped in errands. It became my rebellion, my lifeline, my oxygen. Each session peeled back another layer. I started writing again, not just lists, but full journal entries. Letters to myself. Letters to the woman I'd been. I wrote things like, "You were always enough. He didn't see you, but that doesn't mean you weren't visible. You don't need permission to exist." Some days I felt strong. Other days I felt hollow. But for the first time in years, I felt something. Laura taught me to name things, to stop saying he gets frustrated and start saying he punishes me with silence, to stop saying he's old-fashioned and start saying he controls the narrative, to stop saying I'm overreacting and start saying my feelings are valid. It was like learning a new language, one where I was allowed to matter. The more I spoke in that language, the more I realized how fluent I had become in his. His language was subtle, calculated, loaded with expectations. "Don't be dramatic. You're reading too much into it. You used to be more fun. They sound benign until you hear them in sequence, until you live them, until you realize they've written your entire life script." One day, Laura asked, "Do you want to leave him?" I hesitated, because I did. And I didn't. I missed the fantasy more than the man. I missed who I thought we could have been, not who we were. "I think I want my own heir," I said. She smiled softly. "That's a beginning." I began to plan. Quietly, carefully. Not because I feared violence. Dan had never been physically dangerous, but because I knew his reaction would be cold, strategic, like his journal. He'd turn it into a performance, play the role of the confused husband, the abandoned provider, the man who did everything right. I needed to be prepared. So I started gathering papers, bank statements, copies of the house deed. I opened a private checking account. I made a checklist. Not of revenge, of freedom. Each task was an affirmation. I am real. I am allowed. I do not need his permission to leave the prison he built. At night, I still cooked dinner, still smiled, still played the part. But inside, I was rehearsing a different script, one that ended with me walking out the door not in rage but in clarity. And in therapy, I kept digging, not just into what Dan had done, but into why I had stayed. Because leaving isn't just about packing a suitcase. It's about unpacking the reasons you stayed this long. And slowly I did. One session at a time. One truth at a time. One breath at a time. I don't know how he found the receipts. Maybe I forgot to shred one. Maybe I left my purse unzipped. Or maybe deep down I wanted him to find them. Some part of me tired of the lie, exhausted from walking the tightrope. It was a Tuesday evening, the same kind of evening we'd had thousands of times. Chicken roasting in the oven, the dull hum of the news in the background, the soft clink of silverware as I set the table. Then I saw the envelope on the kitchen counter. My name written in his handwriting. Inside 3 receipts, all from the therapy office, neatly paper-clipped. No note, no accusation, just evidence. I stood still for a long time staring at them. I could hear him upstairs, water running, his footsteps muffled. I didn't panic. I didn't cry. I just waited. When he came down, he didn't speak at first, just looked at me, not angry, not hurt, but calculating. That same expression he used when comparing mortgage rates or choosing car insurance. "You've been going to therapy," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said, voice steady. He looked at me like I'd said something absurd. Why I didn't respond. He moved closer, leaned against the counter. "You should have talked to me, Maggie. We don't need strangers in our marriage." Strangers. As if I hadn't been married to one for 3 decades. "As if you ever listen," I said softly. He blinked, caught off guard by my tone. "I do listen," he replied, already defensive. "I just don't indulge in every emotional detour you take." That phrase, that tone, it was like flipping through an old script one I'd recited too many times. "Dan," I said quietly, "you don't listen. You dismiss. You redirect. You turn everything I feel into a problem that needs solving, or a flaw that needs correcting." He crossed his arms. "You're blowing this out of proportion." There it was, right on cue. I turned away, walked to the sink, and gripped the counter until my knuckles went white. "You read my receipts like a detective," I said, "but you haven't asked me once if I'm okay." He didn't answer. He just watched me, that cold, unreadable stare. "I've been dying in this marriage," I said, slowly, quietly. "And you've either not noticed or not cared." His jaw tensed. "You're being dramatic," he muttered. "Am I?" I turned to face him. "Did you write about me in your notebook because you loved me, or because I was easier to control when you did?" That hit him. His eyes narrowed. "You read that I didn't flinch?" "Yes." There was a long silence. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. Instead, he stepped forward and said, "I've taken care of you, Maggie. I've provided for you. I've never raised a hand to you. I've kept this family stable." "That's not love," I whispered. "That's logistics." He laughed once, bitter sharp. "You think therapy makes you brave? You think some stranger telling you you're oppressed suddenly rewrites 30 years? No," I said. "But it helps me see it clearly." His voice grew colder. "What are you trying to do? Leave me?" I didn't answer right away, because I didn't owe him that answer. Not yet. But in that moment, I realized what he was truly afraid of. It wasn't losing me. It was losing control. "You've always needed me to be small," I said, "because if I wasn't, I might leave." He stepped back like I'd slapped him. "You've lost your mind," he said. No, I replied. I've finally found it. He left the kitchen, slammed the door to his study, and I stood there heart pounding not from fear, but from clarity. The next few days were a dance of tension. He was cold, civil, calculating. He didn't ask about the receipts again, didn't mention therapy. But the shift was there, a new silence different from the old. Not dismissive, not indifferent. This one had weight. It was the silence of a man who knows something is ending and doesn't know how to stop it. He tried in his way. He made dinner one night, poured me wine, complimented my hair. But it was too late, because I'd already tasted something I couldn't untaste. Freedom, perspective, myself. At therapy, I told Laura everything. She nodded, unsurprised. This is the moment he'll try to reel you back, she said. Not with kindness, with confusion. She was right. He began shifting tactics. One morning, he placed a photo album on the coffee table. Our wedding pictures, vacations, Ellie as a baby. He said nothing, just left it open. I closed it. Another evening, he sat beside me and said, I miss us. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, just an attempt to evoke nostalgia. But nostalgia is a memory, not a reason to stay. And I knew he didn't miss me. He missed the version of me who didn't talk back, who made his coffee, who smiled and played along. He missed the woman he could manage. That woman was gone. I still slept beside him, still went through motions. But inside I was already packing. Not clothes, not things. Just courage, just truth. Because once a woman reclaims her voice, the cage doesn't fit anymore, no matter how well decorated it is. I started making my exit plan the same way I had done everything in my marriage, quietly. No announcements, no fireworks. Just precision and intent. I didn't pack a suitcase, not yet. That would be too obvious. Instead, I gathered the essentials slowly, like someone collecting fragments of themselves. A copy of my birth certificate from the hallway file cabinet. A flash drive of our financial documents slipped into a novel on my nightstand. Passwords written in code in the back of a recipe book. I began transferring small amounts of money into the private account I'd opened. Nothing noticeable. Groceries here, a clothing refund there, a careful siphon. Not because I feared Dan would cut me off, but because I didn't want to give him the chance. Every morning, I rehearsed my face in the mirror. Calm, cordial, believable, because I had to wait for the right moment. I didn't want a confrontation. I didn't want to be talked out of my clarity. I knew how convincing he could be when cornered, how his logic sliced through doubt like a scalpel, how he could twist my truths into paranoia with just a few sentences. No, I didn't want a battle. I wanted a clean exit. Ellie called one night, her voice soft. I don't know why, but I've been thinking about you a lot lately, she said. Like, I don't know, just wanting to protect you. I bit my lip, tears burning the corners of my eyes. You're a good daughter, I said. You always were. There was a long pause on her end. Then gently, if you ever needed a place to go, Mom, you know I'd drop everything right. That was the moment I knew I wasn't alone. Not anymore. I started preparing a letter. I wrote it in a password-protected document on my phone, editing it little by little every day. It wasn't angry. It wasn't vengeful. It was a goodbye born from clarity. I wrote, You once told me I was good at keeping things calm. That's true. But calm doesn't mean happy. And obedience isn't love. I stayed because I believed in the version of us that could have existed. But I can't keep living on potential. I am leaving not because I hate you, but because I finally love myself enough to stop disappearing. I practiced what day I would leave. A Thursday. He had a work appointment in the city. Gone by 8:30. Back by 5. I'd have the house to myself. Enough time to pack what mattered. I made a checklist. Important documents. A week's worth of clothes. Jewelry my mother gave me. My journals and voice recordings. The red sweater I'd bought in defiance. I booked a small Airbnb near Ellie's place. 1 bedroom, clean, anonymous. A place to land. I told no one. Not even Ellie. Not yet. I wanted her safety intact. I didn't want her tangled in the middle of it. That week, Dan was unusually pleasant. He made dinner one night pasta with extra cheese. "Your favorite?" he said. I forced a smile. "Thank you." But he wasn't making dinner for me. He was performing normalcy. He felt it, the shift. He couldn't name it. But he knew something was changing. And it was. Because I no longer cared to maintain the illusion. I didn't fill silences anymore. I didn't smile at his jokes. I didn't apologize when I took up space. He didn't know it yet, but he was living with a ghost, a woman already halfway gone. The night before I left, I took one last walk through the house. Our bedroom, the kitchen, the laundry room where I'd once hidden to cry. I stood in the doorway and whispered goodbye. Not to Dan. To her. To the woman I had been so accommodating, so careful, so small. I folded one of my scarves and left it on the pillow. Not as a gift, as a mark. A flag of reclamation. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. Dan was already in the shower humming to himself. I made coffee, packed my bag, left the letter on the kitchen counter. When he walked into the hallway, briefcase in hand, I smiled. "Have a good meeting," I said. "You too," he replied. "Wait, what meeting?" I shrugged. "Just errands." He kissed my cheek. I didn't flinch. I watched him walk to the car, adjust his mirror like always. Then I closed the door behind him gently, silently, and locked it from the inside. I took one last look around. The house was still. Too clean. Too quiet. Like a museum of someone else's life. Then I picked up my bag and walked out the back door. The air outside was cool. Fresh. Full of sound. My phone buzzed. A message from Ellie. "Love you, Mom. Just in case you needed to hear it today." I smiled. I didn't reply. Not yet. I was walking towards something. Myself. And for once, no one could stop me. I disappeared the morning the daffodils bloomed. Not literally, not in a vanishing act kind of way, but in the quiet, deliberate way a woman finally stops asking for permission. I walked out the back door with a single suitcase and my purse. The house behind me looked exactly the same, but it wasn't my home anymore. It was a monument, a place where the walls had memorized my silence more than my laughter. The street was still damp from the early morning dew. The world hadn't noticed yet. That was what I wanted to leave without drama. No explosions, no slammed doors, just freedom folded gently into a Thursday. I didn't drive far, just across town to the Airbnb I'd rented under a pseudonym. It was tucked behind a row of townhouses with a red door and ivy climbing the sides. The space was modest, clean, bare, and more mine than any room I'd slept in for 30 years. I placed my bag on the floor and exhaled. It was the first time in years that I'd been alone without feeling trapped. No footsteps overhead, no humming from the garage, no corrections mid-sentence. Just silence, the real kind. The kind that doesn't demand anything of you. I sat on the bed, still wearing my coat, and let the weight of it all settle. I was gone, and he didn't know yet. The thought came with both relief and guilt. A strange braided emotion I didn't know how to name. I wasn't afraid of Dan's rage, he wasn't that kind of man. But I was afraid of his disappointment, his confusion, his narrative. Because I knew what would come next. He would call, he would text. He would likely drive to my friends' houses, confused, desperate to reassert the version of our life he'd curated so carefully. He would say I was unstable. He would say I was having a late-life crisis. He would say I'd never complained before. And he'd be right. Because I hadn't. I'd kept it all inside, every ache, every withdrawal, every lonely night. But silence doesn't equal consent. It equals survival. At noon, I turned off my phone. I made a cup of tea, not for him, not to fill a table with ritual, but for me. I chose the lavender blend, the one he always said made the house smell too sweet. I wanted sweet. I wanted to drown in it. That afternoon, I walked to the nearest park. I didn't take my purse. I didn't wear makeup. I just went. I sat on a bench and watched the wind rustle through the trees. Children played in the distance. A dog barked. People passed me without a second glance, and I reveled in the anonymity. I was no longer Dan's wife. I was no one. And somehow that was the most liberating feeling in the world. I stayed there until the sun dipped behind the rooftops, then returned to the apartment and pulled out my notebook. I wrote 3 sentences. Today I left. No one screamed, and I didn't vanish. At 7:34 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was Dan. Where are you? No. Are you okay? No. Did something happen? Just a demand for location, for explanation, for control. I turned the phone over, let it buzz again, then again. Eventually, it stopped. I made toast. I curled under the throw blanket. I turned on a movie, something slow, quiet, black and white. The ache didn't come all at once. It arrived slowly like fog. Because as much as I knew I had done the right thing, there was still grief. Grief for the years I'd given him. For the love that once had been real, or at least had felt real. For the hope I'd carried like a sacred stone that he would one day truly see me. I mourned the woman who waited. The one who folded herself into someone else's schedule. The one who silenced her thoughts. The one who once begged with her eyes only to be told she was imagining it. I mourned her, and then I forgave her. She had done what she thought she had to do. But I wasn't her anymore. The next morning, I called Ellie. Her voice cracked when she answered. Mom, I didn't try to explain everything. I just said I'm safe. I'm okay. And I left. She didn't ask for proof. She didn't ask for details. She just said, I'm proud of you. Then after a long pause, do you want to come stay with me for a while? And I said yes. Because freedom, I was learning, didn't have to mean isolation. It could also mean return. Return to softness, to truth, to being loved without performance. I packed my things again, not many, and checked out of the Airbnb that afternoon. I took the long route to Ellie's, stopped for coffee, rolled down the windows, played music as loud as I wanted. Dan called again. I let it ring. I wasn't ready to speak to the man who saw my departure as a betrayal rather than a revelation. Maybe one day we'd talk. Maybe I'd explain. But not now. Not until he understood what I'd been trying to say in every unspoken word for 3 decades. I was never yours to manage. Freedom felt like guilt at first. I didn't expect that. I thought I'd wake up in Ellie's guest room feeling light, unburdened, reborn. But instead, I woke to silence. And instead of peace, it felt like absence. The absence of a routine I'd loathed but relied on. The absence of a man I didn't love anymore, but whose presence had been the wallpaper of my days. The absence of that constant low-grade tension I had carried like a second skin. I sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee, trying to remember how to enjoy it slowly. Ellie had left for work already, a note on the fridge, a fresh loaf of banana bread, a line of encouragement scribbled in her messy print. Take your time. This is your space, too. Her kindness made me cry. I wasn't used to being given space. I wasn't used to belonging somewhere without needing to earn it. For the first few days, I was a shadow in her home. I folded laundry that didn't need folding, washed dishes that were already clean. I kept busy like I had for years, as if productivity might justify my existence. Ellie noticed. Mom, she said gently, You don't have to fill every silence. I looked at her, tears rising again. I don't know how to be still. She sat beside me, took my hand. Then we'll learn together. That afternoon, we watched a movie. Not the kind Dan would have chosen, not a war drama or political thriller, but something warm, soft, and slow. A story about women, about healing. I didn't comment, I didn't analyze, I just watched. And when the credits rolled, I whispered, "That was beautiful." Ellie smiled. "So are you." That night, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. No fan spinning, no body beside me, no invisible script to follow. And still, I felt the guilt curling around me like fog. Not because I missed Dan, but because I didn't. I missed the idea of marriage, the framework, the identity. I missed knowing what each day would look like, even if it suffocated me. Grief, I was learning, doesn't always show up wearing black. Sometimes it shows up in the shape of a routine, in the absence of someone who was never really there. I missed the comfort of knowing my role, even if it was built on my erasure. But each day, the guilt loosened its grip, because each day I did something that reminded me I was free. One morning, I went to a bookstore alone. I wandered the aisles without a clock in my head. I touched the covers, read the backs, sat on a bench by the window and drank a coffee without rushing. I bought 3 books, all by women, all about women, and no one questioned my choices. I left with a tote bag full of stories and a heart a little less heavy. Another day, I walked barefoot in Ellie's small backyard just to feel the grass under my skin. I started writing again, not just journaling, but full pages, letters, thoughts, even poetry. Nothing polished, nothing forced, just words that belonged to me. And for the first time in decades, I felt something strange. Joy. Not the loud kind, not fireworks, just the soft hum of existing without fear. Dan called, of course, multiple times. He left messages measured, confused, increasingly bitter. "Maggie, we can talk about this. Maggie, you're blowing things out of proportion. Why are you doing this to us?" And then finally, "You'll regret this." But I didn't. Not even a little. I blocked his number. It wasn't anger. It was self-preservation. Ellie supported me in everything, but she also gave me space. She didn't hover, didn't press. One night over dinner, she asked, "Do you think you'll ever go back?" I shook my head. Not to him. Not to that life. She reached across the table, squeezed my hand. "I'm proud of you." I smiled. I'm learning to be proud of me too. But the journey wasn't linear. There were moments I questioned myself. When I saw older couples at the park walking hand in hand, I wondered if I had failed. When I watched families gather for brunch, I wondered what story Dan would tell about me. When I heard a song from our wedding, I wondered if any of it had been real. But then I'd return to myself, to the quiet joy of choosing what to eat, what to wear, when to speak. And I remembered I didn't leave because I was angry. I left because I was done performing. Because I had finally asked the question I'd avoided for 30 years. What if I mattered? And I'd answered it. Every day that I woke up and didn't apologize for existing was another answer. Every time I said no without explaining why was another answer. Every breath that felt like my own was a full sentence: I do matter. And I don't need a partner or a role or a title to prove it. Just this: a steady heartbeat. A daughter who sees me, a mind that's finally quiet, a life that is mine. I'm finally a person again. It sounds simple, almost silly, doesn't it? As if I'd just been pretending before. But the truth is, I wasn't pretending I was surviving. I was shape-shifting into the version of myself that fit the life I had built around someone else's comfort. Now I am learning who I am without that shape. Some mornings I still wake up and forget that I don't have to wait for his footsteps upstairs before I start the day. I still move quietly, instinctively, like a ghost in someone else's kitchen. But then I catch myself. I pause. I say, "You're safe," out loud. And I go make the loudest pot of coffee I want. I'm no longer living in Ellie's guest room. She helped me find a small apartment 10 minutes from her place, a sunny space with crooked floorboards and windows that rattle when it's windy. I love every imperfection. I hung my favorite books on open shelves. I bought candles, the strong floral ones Dan always hated. I even framed a photo of myself at 29, the one where I'm laughing in the sun holding Ellie on my hip. She visited last week and said, "You look like her again." I told her I'm starting to feel like her too. We made pasta together and danced in the kitchen. No one told us it was too loud. No one sighed from the other room. No one corrected our joy. I still go to therapy. It's not about Dan anymore. Not really. It's about me, the woman I buried under compromise, under politeness, under obedience. It's about learning to live without apology. Some sessions are quiet. Some are full of tears. But all of them remind me that healing isn't a single moment, it's a series of choices. Every day I choose myself, I heal a little more. I've started volunteering at the local library again, not because I need to, but because I want to. Because the smell of books and the hum of quiet conversation feels like home in a way that marriage never did. One afternoon, while shelving returns, I found a copy of a poetry book I'd loved in college. I flipped it open, and there it was. The line I had underlined all those years ago. There are marriages that feel like slow suicides. I didn't flinch this time, because now I know what it feels like to be alive. Dan never responded to my letter. Not directly. I've heard from mutual friends that he's telling people I snapped or ran away without warning. I don't bother correcting the narrative. Let him keep his story. I'm busy writing my own. Ellie said something the other day that stayed with me. We were walking through a weekend market sipping coffee, and she said, "You know, I think part of me grew up the day you left Dad." I looked at her surprised. Why? Because I realized that strength doesn't always look like staying. Sometimes it looks like walking away even when everyone else says you're lucky to be there. She was right. People said I was lucky. A stable husband, a nice house, a quiet life. But luck doesn't mean fulfillment. Security isn't the same as being seen. And a cage lined with silk is still a cage. I no longer need to explain that to anyone, because I'm not trying to prove I was right. I'm just trying to live, to sit in the sun without asking permission, to cry without shame, to laugh without rehearsing it first, to want things, to name them, to go get them. Sometimes I still grieve, not for Dan, but for the years I lost to silence, for the birthdays I spent pretending, for the dinners where I swallowed my truth, for the woman who tried so hard to be easy, lovable, small. I grieve her, but I also thank her. She kept me alive long enough to become this woman, the one who now walks into a room without bracing for disapproval, the one who says no, the one who takes up space. And as I sit on my little balcony in the morning sipping my strong coffee, I think about all the women still stuck in beautiful prisons painted with politeness, paved with routine, framed by obligation. I want to say to them, "You're not imagining it. You're not too sensitive. You're not selfish for wanting more. You're alive. And you deserve to live like it." So here's my invitation, not just from me, but from every woman who ever folded herself to fit inside someone else's life unfold. Take up the whole page, If you've made it to the end of my story, thank you. Not just for listening, but for witnessing. And if any part of this story echoes inside you, I hope you'll do one thing: tell someone. Because silence may be safe, but truth is freedom. Please like, comment, and subscribe to Grace's Truth if this story resonated with you, and if you have your own story to share, the comments are open. You are not alone.